All right, there we go. Kind of, it helps to record. As I was saying, thank you everybody for being here, taking the time out with busy schedules and different time zones to be able to hop on a podcast and to discuss some important but interesting topics. So I will start off with some introductions. I'll talk a little bit about the purpose of what we're going to be doing, and then I'll pose a couple questions for us to kind of think about as we go throughout the podcast. That'll kind of help with our navigation of the topics here. So the themes that we'll be exploring today on the Race and Social Justice podcast are race, history and the formation of social thought regarding distinctions between groups of people, social, moral, behavioral superiority and inferiority, desirability versus undesirability, connection to social justice and criminal justice, fairness, and then all of these things in the context of the American racism and social stratification interplay with social and criminal justice. Given we are all American and American racism is what we are probably prone to experience and know the most about. Okay, so start it off. We're just going to go around and do introductions. If you would state your name, and for the purpose of this podcast, to identify what race you identify with. And I think it might be helpful for everybody who doesn't know each other to tell a little bit about both yourself and then how you know me or met me. So I'll do mine last, and I'll pick on Hasina first since she was last.
All right, hey everybody. My name is Hasina Polk. I am a biologist. I know Ian from high school. Yeah, we go back.
Cool. And then after you're done, if you'll just call on somebody else's name, and we'll go from there.
Okay, Sandy.
Hi everyone, it's nice to meet you. I'm Sandy. I am a psychology PhD at Portland State University. I'm in my third year. I identify as Latina, and Ian was my psychology best bud at Western, and we studied and cried. Not really, but just spent a lot of good time in the library, working, studying on a lot of different classes, I think, but especially stats. I think that's our most hard but cherished memory. And I'll pick on Eric.
All right. I'm Eric. Is my picture showing up?
Yep.
Okay. African American male. I've known Ian since my freshman year, but he's basically like family now because he knew my family before I had moved back home. So he was already a part of the family. I'm just a blending operator, just a lead manager at a production plant, making like collagen, baby formula, stuff like that. And I'll call on Nick.
All right, so my name is Nick. I'm from Wisconsin. I met Ian when I moved out to Oregon, went to school at Western Oregon University as a political science major. We lived in Landers Hall together, and now I'm back in Wisconsin. Now I'm the general manager of a McDonald's, so pretty glamorous work.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for those introductions. And my name is Ian. I'm the host of this podcast. This is my first time ever hosting a podcast. So I hope I do it justice. I'm currently a master's student in the organizational leadership program at Western Oregon University. I also got my undergraduate degree in psychology from Western Oregon University. And currently for work, I am a graduate assistant in the institutional research department, where I do data collection and research about issues pertaining to higher education. Great. Thank you, everybody, for that. So now I kind of want to move in briefly into talking about some ground rules. And I don't necessarily want me to just list out what the ground rules are. I kind of want it to be a collaborative experience, and kind of all of us have input on what we are kind of expecting from each other, expecting of ourselves, and kind of the standards that we want to operate on, given that this is quite a sensitive topic and can evoke a lot of different kind of emotions. So kind of if people are new to that idea, kind of what we'll do is we'll go around and we'll kind of discuss some of the things that work well for you in a learning environment, in terms of, like I said, rules, standards, whatever, and then we'll kind of agree upon kind of a group of different things and then move forward from there. Does that sound all right?
That sounds excellent.
I'll kind of start it off to get it going. So for me, off rip, the very first thing has to be respect and communication. I think respecting doesn't necessarily mean you have to respect everybody's idea, but you should respect the fact that people are sharing their ideas and being open to new ideas. And then communication, especially since we're on an online Zoom format, it's really important that even though it'd be really nice if we're all in person, we can kind of talk over each other, it'd be a little bit different. But for this format, in terms of getting information shared, I think we should be mindful of not talking over one another and not interrupting when somebody else is speaking. So if someone else just wants to jump in, you can go ahead and do that.
I didn't really have anything to add. I just agree. As long as we're all heard and we get a chance to be heard, then that's good for me.
Okay.
Yeah, I also agree. I feel like those are basic ground rules for any discussion would be respect first, and I think we're all gonna be just fine to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I'm looking forward to learning from y'all.
Same.
All right, cool. That's good to hear, because that's exactly what I'm wanting this to be, something not necessarily like a lecture. I'm not going to be speaking to you the whole time and you just sitting here listening to me monologue. There'll be times where I might monologue just to give information or context, but then I really want you guys to feel free to jump in and to talk amongst yourselves, direct things to me. But my role here primarily is to facilitate and to moderate. I might chime in here or there with my opinions, but don't be surprised, given that you all know me pretty well, don't be surprised if I don't give many opinions this time around. Okay. And I also want to note at this point that that race often intersects with other identities that we hold, such as, but not limited to, religion, gender and sex, national origin, sexual orientation. And so it wouldn't be improper for any of us to mention other identities when we're talking about race. So feel free to make connections to other identities you hold, and other themes relating to that. Lastly, in terms of our introductions and kind of just housekeeping things, I just want to make it clear for the record that this is the project designed to fulfill requirements for a graduate level course final in the Criminal Justice Department at Western Oregon University for an elective requirement that's being applied to the Master's in Organizational Leadership degree. The opinions expressed in this podcast presentation are solely those of the persons expressing them and not a representation of Western Oregon University, any other academic institution, or any affiliates. And before we dive into more content, I have two questions that are kind of rhetorical right now. And so I just kind of want you to think about them as we go through, and then we'll revisit them again at the end to see maybe if we can answer them or comment on them. So the first kind of question, or really more so just a purpose, is we want to understand, or the focus of this podcast is wanting to better understand the forces and historical events, ideas, and movements that shape how humans, one, view race, and two, use this information to draw conclusions and inferences about people from those perspectives. So in other words, what things in history, what present things, ideas, movements, events have influenced the way that we view people who are different than we are. And the second question is then how do these perceptions or biases affect how certain groups of people are treated in society? Are some groups treated differently than others based on their race or group affiliation? So I want to let you guys kind of think about those things as we go along. So now we're going to move into definitions and history of race. Definitions of race. So before this podcast, I sent out a short, relatively short document with a few definitions to get us all kind of oriented in the same direction. I want to make a note that those are not absolute definitions by any means, and they can be added on, expounded upon, and whatnot. But what I want to make clear is that for our purposes, it should be agreed upon that those are at least the base level definitions. That is nothing lower than what has been described in that document. And so in those documents, we asked a question, or I asked a question of you guys to describe, for each of you to describe your own definition of race. And if you guys are able to, I'd like to go around and each of us share how we define race, or how we think, or what we view race as. And again, feel free to jump in at any time.
Ooh, oh, so I define race by physical characteristics, although I believe that it's a social construct that has been used to further divide people and categorize us. And it really doesn't have anything to do with who we actually are and our heritage and our genes.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
Yeah, I guess to piggyback off that, I think I would agree. I would categorize race as, like a physical appearance. Typically, obviously, it would go more towards skin color. I mean, I guess the social construct is where I kind of get lost, but I do feel like there are certain subcultures within races. And I mean, I feel like it's more in communities, regional communities, more urban populations, non-urban populations. I feel like there's a whole subset of different cultures besides race. So I guess I kind of like the definition that you shared on race in the document. And since that a group of people share a hereditary feature, I guess that kind of baseline is where I would put it as to, if I were to define it, I would just say it's more of a hereditary feature, a physical feature, if you will.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you.
I completely agree with everything that has been said. I have always also kind of considered like social traits as well, or like practices, or yeah. But I completely agree with like the social construct of it, and like for my experiences, how things have been a little bit like confusing and tricky, and I can get more into detail about why later on in our conversation. But I appreciate that you mentioned the aspect of it being a social construct, and yeah.
Thank you.
For me, I thought about this question. I would just say, I guess really for me, race is just like bloodline. Because like, I remember when I moved to Indiana when I was younger, and I saw the first time I ever encountered an albino person, and I had no idea what that was. And that kind of is just based off what you guys said with features. And I didn't know what it was. And I asked my mom, and it turns out that person ended up being African American. They were just white. Never saw anything like that. So I guess to me, it's just bloodline and hearing and learning from people what actually is in their DNA. That's what I've always based it off of.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. I appreciate that. So as Nick alluded to, the definition that I gave of race is actually not my definition. It's from a scholar named Brace, last name Brace. And so the definition of race that we'll use going forward is an inference that a group of people share a hereditary feature that is not present in other groups. Another definition that I want to put out there is the definition of racism. This comes from Frederick's 2002. And Fredericks defines racism as the application of a racialist outlook. And racialist is just the idea that race exists. The application of a racialist outlook as the basis for unfair or unpleasant racial comparisons or treatment. Quote, racialists do not become racist until they make such convictions the basis for claiming privileges for members of what they consider to be their own race and for disparaging and doing harm to those deemed as racially other. Does anybody have, and you don't have to, just pausing, if anybody has any comments on that definition. Okay. And so before we move into excuse me, because the next section we're going to talk about is ethnocentrism, stereotypes, and social justice. But before we get there, I kind of want to give a somewhat short, not so short, history of race, starting from early civilizations and all the way up to the early 20th century. And feel free to take notes or to make comments in the chat, and and we can address that afterwards. But I'm reading from something also, just to make that clear. I'm reading from something that I wrote, given the course material and the research literature that we've read throughout this term. So the idea of race can be traced to early civilizations such as Mesopotamia, the Hebrews, Greeks, and Romans. The ancient slave trade, which predates writing, created social ideologies surrounding attributions of desirability and undesirability, particularly to slaves as, quote, lesser than, and therefore worthy of oppression and subjugation. The 10th and 11th century slave markets favored Muslims. After 12th century, it was reversed to favor Christians. In this market, mostly Africans were sold to Europeans. The slave trade followed the basic principles of supply and demand, making slaves a low-priced commodity. Darker-skinned persons were viewed as good slave labor and therefore were justified to work as slaves. The word slave is derived from the word Slav, which describes prisoners from Slavonic tribes of Europe captured by Germans and sold to Arabs during the Middle Ages. Improvements in maritime technology and capability meant increased contact with different groups. The observed phenotypic and behavioral differences between groups leads to a division of ideas, namely monogenism and polygenism. The transatlantic slave trade saw Africans working with indentured servants until the collapse of indentured servitude, where Africans filled the void. The development of science and emphasis on observation and comparison gave way to intellectual explorations and definitions of race. Carl Linnaeus develops a taxonomy and binomial nomenclature to describe the system of natural species, which he publishes in Systemae Naturae in 1735, and places humans in primate order with apes and monkeys. A contemporary of Linnaeus, George Buffon, asserts the white race as the norm and that other groups need explanation, to which his explanation for differences in why races, the explanation that he has for why races are different were largely due to differences in climates, he asserts. Around the same time, a German physician named Johann Friedrich Blumenbach coins the term Caucasian and describes 5 categories of humans based on phenotypes: Caucasians, Mongoloids, Ethiopians, Americans, and Malays. He also claimed that any group that differed from Caucasians were, quote, degenerations, and that Caucasians were closer to God than any other group. In America, laws are written to further divide whites from blacks, citing the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705. In 1765, slaves lobbied for freedom in the American Revolution. The 1800s saw many slaves escape into northern US and Canada. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution banned slavery, except for indentured servitude, in 1865. With millions of free blacks, the question is raised about the status of their citizenship in America, in which the 3/5 law is enacted. Formal and informal laws are enacted to further limit minority, mainly black, mobility in America. The US Census contains items related to race, but it is whether one is free or enslaved that is more important. The Naturalization Act of 1790 reserves citizenship for free whites only. Without citizenship, one could not vote, file suit, own property, or testify in court, further dividing whites and non-whites and enslaved persons. Darwin's theory of evolution highlighted topics that previously had very little to no scientific backing or explanation. Through evolution and natural selection, Darwin could explain the development and extinction of a species and provide a means for the side-by-side existence of 2 different species that were neither better nor worse than the other. This gave way to many interpretations of his work and eventually the era of social Darwinism came about. Social forces were tied to natural selection, and it was thought that cultural traits are coded for by biological inheritance. The studies of phrenology and anthropometry gave rise to various typologies that were used to advance racist ideologies. It is also important to note here that prior to the age of discovery in the 15th century, familiarity with the world was confined to what a person could walk, which was approximately 25 miles. This is known as the peasant perspective. So as people are coming in contact with seemingly drastically different groups of people who are divergent from what they know, look like, sound like, and cultural differences, questions about who are these people and where do they come from start to come about. Changes in physical appearances are gradual rather than abrupt. And that is a brief history to give us some context into how the idea of race, one, came about. It was not always an idea that people had, but then also how different events throughout history changed the ideas that people have about people from different groups. And that's really the crux of what I'm wanting to get at in this podcast. It's trying to explore and understand different forces that lend its hand to the psychology of why people think of different groups the way they do, and how that interplays with racism and fairness, social justice, criminal justice, etc. Lastly, historically, traits that are visible, such as skin color, were not referred to as race early on. Very little research in archaeology and paleontology about race. Very few recorded ideas of race prior to the 15th century, although there was ethnocentrism. So I'll pause there. I don't see anything in the chat. I don't think so. No, I don't see anything in the chat, but I'll open it up. I know that was a lot of information. If there was anything particularly that anybody wanted to comment on, feel free to. If not, give me thumbs up and we can go on. Okay, everybody good? Okay.
Oh yeah.
Cool. So I mentioned that early on there were no mentions or references to race. It was largely ethnocentrism. Is everybody or is anybody familiar with ethnocentrism?
Are you speaking like more to like the apartheid type?
Just
Or-
ethnocentrism as an idea, just as a concept, if people are familiar with it. I saw Eric shake his head no. So just so we're all clear of what ethnocentrism is, essentially ethnocentrism is the belief that your group or your ethnicity or your tribe, your faction is superior to another. In this case, ethnocentrism, meaning your ethnicity, your skin color, your race is superior to another, meaning, which also then implies that others are inferior. Let's see. So given that understanding that one group thinks they're better than another group, what kind of attributions or perceptions might the better group have about a bad group? So in other words, if I'm in the good group, what things might I think about people who are in the bad group?
They could think that they're ignorant or savages.
Yes.
Like really negative oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just those stereotypes that could be discussed among those groups, and then even people as early as like children can go to school, and like it could impact like discrimination among like peers and stuff like that. So just yeah, just the influencing like unfair treatment, discrimination.
Yes, absolutely. Nick, were you going to say something?
Well, I think you kind of spoke about intelligence and why somebody might think that their cohort of people are, say, more intelligent than a different cohort of people. I mean, obviously, the superiority factor. I feel there are some people who really believe, from an egotistical standpoint, that their group is just the best. But I think that how you define intelligence can be super varied. Say, like back in more like the peasant serfs time, where there were certain tribes throughout Africa, or even the Native Americans, when they soared across the oceans, they thought they weren't as intelligent because of the, technological advancements that the Europeans had, but they were intelligent in their own ways as far as like agriculture, farming, and tribing together. So I feel like, I don't know, I guess that was just a point I wanted to make, that people only view intelligence through their understanding of intelligence, just like humans do for like animals. We don't see animals as being super intelligent because they're maybe not manipulating their environment or speaking a language as complex as ours, but maybe we just don't understand the language or understand their level of intelligence in different areas. So I feel like that's where some of the ignorance comes into play, because you don't see how the other cohort of people or group of people are as intelligent and you in certain areas. So I don't know.
I think that's a great point, and so we'll talk a little bit more about intelligence and how that's been used also. So I think that's a great point. Eric, did you have anything you wanted to add on that one?
No, I mean, I think we're all in agreement that obviously they just think of other people as less than. But I really did like his thought process on the whole intelligence thing, because I've never really heard anybody talk about it like that, but that is very true.
Yeah, I agree. I thought he laid that out pretty well. And so, given all of our comments, I think my next question is kind of fitting. The question that I had about that is this how, or is ethnocentrism and kind of that thought process, is that how stereotypes arise, or is that one force that might manifest a stereotype? What are your thoughts on ethnocentrism fueling stereotypes? And if you don't have a response, that's okay too. I know it's very similar to what we just were saying, but I just kind of wanted to make it kind of an official point, or at least discuss it, what others think in terms of, I'm better than you, you're worse than me.
As to why they would feel that way, or
Not necessarily why, but just the thought process of thinking one group is better than the other, and like how you were saying, like how you were saying of people using different kind of tools. Somebody who's sailing the ocean might look at another boat and say, "Oh, look at the whatever the flags they're using for their sails. That material sucks. We got a way better material than that. Those people must be dumb. How come they don't know about that?" And so then you'll think, okay, everybody with a blue boat is dumb. And so every blue boat you see that comes down the water, you're going to say, oh, there's another group of those dumb people. And so my question is how does ethnocentrism fuel stereotypes, or does it?
I think it definitely could fuel stereotypes, but also there's like a lot of other things that influence stereotypes too, like what Nick was saying, like the ignorance of not really knowing about other cultures before you kind of like just jump in and kind of judge people. I think like that's one of the things that people do. Like the first time you see somebody, you're judging them. Like you might not want to admit it, but it's like human nature to just kind of judge. And I think some stereotypes come from judging, some come from ignorance. And yeah.
Absolutely. That kind of segues into my next question of asking kind of more of a fun question in terms of, are stereotypes good or are stereotypes bad? And I'll start just with a small comment, kind of piggybacking off what Hasina was talking about of it is human nature, and there have been a plethora of psychological research to support the fact that humans do make assumptions based on looks, based on appearance, based on interaction, based on facial expressions, and so on. And that comes from, at least from an evolutionary standpoint, that comes from things such as safety, such as group membership, group affiliation, cooperation, friend versus foe, different things like that. So my opinion on that would be that stereotypes are both. They're both good and bad. I think stereotypes are important for us as humans to be able to make very quick decisions with some relative accuracy, right? A lot of times it may not be accurate, but some stereotypes could be accurate, and allowing us to be able to process that information quicker than actually having to experience maybe somebody doing something wrong to us, right? We might be able to preempt that with some sort of stereotype that works. But then it gets over to kind of the bad side when we use that to generalize all people, to conjure up perceptions that we apply in every situation all across the board, right? It's no longer situational or individual versus individual. Now this is becoming part of our thought process and part of our worldview. So sorry. So the question again is, are stereotypes good, or are stereotypes bad, or both?
I'll go off of what you said. I'll say good for the point of the fact that it's also kind of good for people to know that those intrusive thoughts are like something that are okay to hear and process through. And it's like makes you feel kind of normal. Like, yeah, okay, even if it was a fucked up thought, like other people do feel that way. And then bad, obviously, because of how it affects people, stuff like that.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point.
I think it really depends. I think most of us like hear stereotype and like, yeah, unfortunately, like in my experience is that they have mostly contributed to like a negative comment about a group, or like for my culture, like the one I hear the most is like that like Mexicans are lazy. So that's a stereotype, but another stereotype I hear is that like for example, I work a lot with like schools and uh Latin students, and so a lot of like my white peers who are researchers say, oh, like we need to ask these kids about their family because they value familismo, they value like so they're like making assumptions about like what is or like what the values of these students are just based on like a few experiences, or I guess like one piece of literature. And this assumption could actually be beneficial because it could turn out that these kids really did build trust from those like researchers allowing them the space to talk about their family.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I appreciate that. Anybody else?
Well, I guess I don't know. Not to continue. I don't know. You're trying to move on,
No,
but
go ahead.
I feel like people, especially uneducated people, confuse correlation with causation. So, I mean, I think that might be embedded in our DNA. So, say somebody experiences something just by chance, multiple times in a row, they might correlate that with something dangerous. Especially when, if you're talking about earlier how things are kind of embedded in our DNA. Well, like our fight or flight instincts. So like back when we were idiots and knuckleheads and cavemen, and if we, thought that a couple times, we went down to the river and the rock fell in, and I guess my my example is bad. I'm kind of just going off the cuff, but if something bad happens multiple times by chance, they might just be like, oh, then they'll correlate that as causation, rather than just chance. So I guess trying to make a point to what I'm trying to say is some people who are ignorant are unable to distinguish correlation and causation. They might, if something happens to them a couple different times, they might correlate, say they got stuff stolen from them a couple different times from a certain ethnicity or race of people. They are ignorant to correlation and causation. They're going to distinguish that event happening with, oh, those people steal more, or whatever the case may be. I guess I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm just kind of rambling, but
No,
you kind of follow what I'm saying.
No, I was just about to say, yeah, I think that makes perfect sense, and I think that kind of alludes, especially to your kind of your ancestral example, kind of points back to the peasant perspective, right? Or I guess the idea of I only know what I see, right? And this kind of goes back to also kind of issues with kind of homogeneity, right? And the same. So for instance, if white people only hang out with white people, it's probably going to be more likely that they have negative or definitely ignorant views of other groups, because they're not exposed to, they don't have experience with, they can't confirm nor deny certain things. So if you're only exposed to what you know and what you see, you're going to be limited in your ability to understand other groups, and that, and especially if we're talking before like people are going on boats, definitely before people are driving cars or flying airplanes, people are really stuck to the people who look like them, who sound like them, who think the way that they do, right? And as we start in throughout history, as we start running into different groups, for instance, Europeans with Native Americans, so on and so forth, then it's like, wow, these people are really different than we are, and we do this much better than they do, right? And that's kind of how you start that idea of I'm better, they're not, we're more effective, we're not effective, right? And how other people have commented, there's different standards to judge what's good and what's not good, and so it's not beneficial to stereotype in that way.
Well, yeah, and to circle back to your main question, which is stereotyping good or bad? I mean, the fact of the matter is that we discriminate all the time. I don't think stereotypes are good when you're stereotyping somebody for something that they have no control over. But we discriminate every day in our lives. When I interview people for employment, I'm discriminating on what they're wearing and how they present themselves, how they speak, and what they can allude to, how they can contribute to my company. Or we discriminate in our sexual partners and our friend groups, and who we spend our time with, and what we want to do. We discriminate all the time based off factors that we like or don't like, and the utility of those things that are being put in front of us. So I think some level of discrimination is healthy in certain instances, but when it comes down to stereotyping people in a broad way and saying this group of people based off nothing that they can control and they were just born this way with this skin color or into this ethnicity or this part of the world, they had no control over that. I can't think of the word. There's particular words saying that they don't have control over, I guess, but.
No, I think that's a great point. Kind of, and I apologize for kind of interrupting you there. Kind of an idea I had though, as you were saying that, was kind of this assignment of privilege, or the stereotypes get negative when we assign privilege or disadvantage to one group or another based on that stereotype or based on this inference that we're making, you know what I mean? Because it's one thing to have the stereotype and to think that, but there's another to act on that, to have thought processes that influence behavior, right? That's where, from my understanding and from my experience, where it gets off the rails.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I appreciate that. Actually, on my little note sheet here, I had a couple other things about stereotypes, but I think we covered stereotypes quite well. So I appreciate everybody's comments on that. Okay. And so this kind of leads us then to an idea of social justice, themes of unfairness and fairness, right and wrong, judgment of morality and behavior, and so forth. And we got to this idea of social justice because we talked about essentially good versus bad, privileged versus unprivileged, which then, like I said, plays into ideas of fairness, who deserves what, when certain things happen, what should the punishments be for certain things. So I just broadly again want to put or ask out there if anybody wants to comment on what their idea of social justice is, and what kind of ideas or concepts do you think about when you hear social justice? And I can repeat the question also. I know I just gave a lot of information at once.
I feel bad. I don't want to dominate the conversation. But I feel like when I think of social justice, what I want would be equality of opportunity rather than necessarily equality of outcome. I think everybody should have equal opportunity to make whatever they want in their life, or pursue whatever they want in life, not based off arbitrary factors that are out of their control. And I think that what we want, at least from like a governing body or from a social justice perspective, would be the equality of opportunity, regardless of those arbitrary factors such as race or ethnicity or where you're born or
how much money you have or who you're married
exactly
to.
social status. Yeah, definitely.
I think it's a good point.
I agree with the distribution of opportunity amongst people, but I also feel like I'm learning a lot about equity, and it's not the same as equality. Like equality means that everybody gets the same amount, but there are people who have just suffered from or historically just been very vulnerable populations that even if they get the same level of opportunities because of that historical vulnerability and they're still gonna have trouble reaching like like economic stability, for example. So the point of equity is groups that a group might get more than another group because that they have been lacking it for so long. And so like I don't know if I think in high school I saw like this picture where like everybody had the same height of like box, but like there was like some shorter kids, so it even though they had the same box, like not everybody could see over the fence. And so equity was like the smallest kid has a bigger one and then now they can all see. So I think um I really value the aspect of equity as well.
Absolutely. I think that's a very salient point. And I also have seen that that graphic you're talking about, and the kind of the summary that that picture gives me, or the idea, the way that I kind of to think about it, is the amount of whatever it is needed to reach a certain mark, to reach a certain benchmark, is going to be different for different groups. Because as you mentioned, what I need, right, to get to this certain place, Hasina might need, and I'm not talking white, black, male, female, just person to person. If uh if what I get gets me to a certain place, but Hasina is further back than I am, then she's going to need more to catch up to me. So we can't get the same thing, because then she'll still be behind me. We'll just be at the same pace. She'll be behind me and I'll be going, or I'll be behind her and she'll be going forward. So I just wanted to make a side tangent on that. I think that's a great analogy.
I guess where I run into trouble would be it's hard to define. I mean, with that particular graphic, which I've seen as well, it's easy to define, how much the small child needs to see over the fence. But I think from a social justice perspective, or a large governing body, I think that it's hard to determine how much equity or what type of equity is necessary to what end until it's equal. I think those lines can blur, but I feel like as long as everybody, like you kind of said, starts at the same starting point and has the same rights and the same opportunities, then I think the only thing that, as long as there's not like a institutional disadvantage, I think that if you starting at the same line, there's no institutional disadvantage. That is the only difference is how much you are willing to pursue, what you desire, as far as is it financial gain, is it prominent career success. I think the most important thing is everybody starting at the same line, at least from an institutional perspective.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I think that what Sandy was saying about equity, it's very important because in America, especially, there's like a lot of systems that have been put in place so that people can't prosper. And yeah, I think it's very important to try to bridge those gaps and to open different spaces to different people that haven't been exposed to certain spaces, so that we can all have equal opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you. Eric, I know some of us have jumped in a couple different times. Was there anything that you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, I was just waiting for everybody because basically everything they said, mine's kind of like a different point. Like for me, social justice, when I think about that, is like all the work that it takes to get to the social justice that you guys are all talking about. And that's kind of like how people feel like up front to kind of bring it forward. And like, again, all the hard work, like if you want this, you got to work for it. But again, if you start and I start, we don't get the same ways to work for it. And how can we actually fix that? It's just a lot of building that is going to take a lot longer than just sitting here saying this and that, because that hasn't been working for us.
Absolutely. Yeah. I chuckle because I just chuckle at the ridiculousness of that. Nothing, we know it, we talked about it, we've researched it, we've put it in journals, we put it on the news, we put it on bulletin boards, and we still can't get it right. We still are not, we're not applying what we're learning, right? There's no synthesis of knowledge into application of actually, you know what I'm saying, putting these things into order. And which is why conversations like what we're having right now are so important. And to have each different, even though we're talking about the same thing, everybody kind of has a different point that they're adding to it. And so that's also then highlights the importance of drawing different points of view, drawing different perspectives, asking people who don't, right, not thinking of things like we talked about before, not looking at things from one perspective, one group's way of thinking. You know what I mean? We need to employ and recruit all different types of people: men, women, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, LGBTQ, all of the above. So, excuse me, I had to make a statement on that. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Because social justice is going to continue to play out in our discussion. And just for time's sake, we're probably about 60% of the way through. So we'll be wrapping up here in not too long. I understand we're going over the hour that I kind of quoted in the beginning, but I don't know about you guys, but I think we've been having a pretty good conversation. So if everyone is good to keep going, then we will. If you need to hop off, totally understand that. But if not, then we'll move forward. Okay, I think everybody is good. So earlier in my little history background there, I mentioned a term, which is actually an idea and then became a movement, called social Darwinism. And we talked about Darwin previously, and he's the guy who came up with the theory of natural selection. And a lot of times that's referred to as Darwinism or evolutionary Darwinism and other names. But social Darwinism is a concept that was developed by a British philosopher who was actually a contemporary of Darwin, named Herbert Spencer. And social Darwinism is the idea that cultural traits can or social forces can be tied to heritability or inheritance. And alongside that idea was a confounding and again contemporaneous idea called phrenology. And in the little handout that I gave before this, I gave a 5-minute YouTube video link about phrenology. And so I want to give again just a little bit of history, a little bit of context of social Darwinism and phrenology, and then we'll go in and kind of tie that into what discussions we've kind of already been having in terms of how this contributes to people's ideas of race, justice, equality, equity, and so on. So I'll begin. So social Darwinism and phrenology add to the ideas and beliefs of racial differences in criminality, and therefore criminality and just society in general, and therefore further justifying unjust treatment. In the late 19th century, a contemporary of Darwin, British philosopher Herbert Spencer, was one of the first people who tied social forces to natural selection. He's actually the one who coined the term survival of the fittest. Darwin also used the term survival of the fittest in his work, but the idea actually came before Darwin's prediction. Darwin actually quoted Herbert Spencer. So he coined the term survival of the fittest to describe competition among human individuals and groups. But instead of physical adaptations like Darwin talked about, Spencer saw that wealth and power were signs of fitness. Spencer believed that cultural traits were coded for by biological inheritance. Through competition, less fit groups and cultures will be naturally weeded out. Excuse me. Social Darwinism began in England but then soon spread to the United States. The principles of social Darwinism fit well with the racial purity ideologies in America at the time. Spencer's views have since been proven false, but not before it already caused the damage to so many people's minds with erroneous claims. Another confounding idea that was practiced around this time was created by German physiologist Franz Joseph Gall, called phrenology, the study of the development of locations in the brain to understand human ability, both intellectual and personality traits. This idea asserts that by just examining the outside shape of the head, one could see the development of each cerebral organ inside the brain that's responsible for different intellectual and personality traits, which I think all of us can agree just on hearing that, how silly that sounds, of being able to tell by the way that your head is shaped, whether you're smart, whether you have a propensity for criminality, so on and so forth, whether you're moral, immoral, whatever. But anyway, and so this idea of phrenology was though based on the real premise that areas of the brain are localized. For example, the area of the brain known as Broca's area, which is responsible for the development of speech. Okay, those were some longer definitions of both social Darwinism and phrenology. I first just want to give a general, just a hands up, thumbs down, if anybody has heard of these terms before, social Darwinism or phrenology. Hasina, yes. Sandy, yes. Eric, yes and no. Oh, yes. I'm sorry, I thought you were doing yes and no. Nick, yes. Okay, great. Perfect. So similar to the question I asked on the little worksheet, what limitations do you see with using phrenology, or how might the inferences drawn from phrenological methods, so how the conclusions that we get from measuring or looking at somebody's shape of their head, what limitations might there be with that, or what kind of errors might somebody make?
I guess like this goes back to Nick saying people not knowing what they don't know and judging what they don't see. Like you're not used to this person's head shape, so you're going to say that they're smart, like not smarter than you, ignorant, whatever you want to call it.
Yep, totally. I also think that phrenology can be really dangerous because, to Eric's example of looking at somebody's head and making assumptions about it, do you see that it could be problematic if, say, for instance, Franz Joseph Gall, the guy who created this, sees a lump on the right side of the prefrontal cortex area, the forehead area here. And so say this person that has the bump on their head committed murder, right? So then now the next couple of people that also have that bump, he might make the inference that they're murderers. And before they even, and we'll touch on this a little bit later, before they even display any criminological behavior, we might be able to put restrictions on this person. We might be able to confine them. We might be able to say things about their morality or immorality just by measuring the skull of the head, or making an attribution, or making a particular remark about a certain morphological feature that has indications about X, Y, and Z. So I just wanted to make that point. So I appreciate everybody else's comments as well. Okay, so now we're going to move on. And so now I think we have a good background and a good foundation of how different ideas about race tie into perceptions and social justice. And so now I kind of want to tie this into America more specifically. And as most of us, I think all of us are well aware, America has a very unique, I guess, for lack of a better term, racism environment, and a very different racial environment than really any other country that we've seen, both in modern times and in history. There are similarities, but especially in terms of the systemic issues. Anyway, I'm getting too tangential here. So again, I'm going to give a little short background. I promise this is shorter than the other ones. But so in America, ideally, at least we claim that we try to uphold civility, pro-social morality, and values and order. People have been trying to maintain societal order from the ancestral environment and continue to this day. The study of criminology and/or criminal anthropology has sought to integrate scientific principles into the understandings of criminal behavior, criminal psychology, the propensity for crime, etc. The father of criminology, Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso, made many efforts to categorize, label, differentiate, understand, and identify criminals and criminal behavior using seemingly scientific approaches to explain how criminological behavior or tendencies were innate to one's biology and therefore predetermined. His ideas about, quote unquote, the natural criminal and using measurements and observations of one's physical traits to describe their potential for criminality led to major shifts in how Western scholars and authorities viewed crime. Which, as we can all attest to, when people in positions of authority, people in positions of power, or in seeming, experts, when they say something, the layperson or just a normal average person, a lot of times are going to believe or take for word and truth of what they're saying. So if we're having authorities and experts propagating these ideas, we can see how that might bleed into the overall societal fabric and overall societal ideology. Anyway, I digress. Americans added emphases on the testing of intelligence and quote unquote the weak mind as a reason people commit crimes, quote unquote feeble-mindedness. Scientific authorities have tried to assert that abilities such as intelligence are related to differences in status levels for quite some time. The issue, though, is that the test did not actually test actual intelligence, and often contain questions that were culturally specific, and thus persons not from the predominant group are likely to score poorly because they aren't aware of, essentially they don't know what they don't know. However, the use of intelligence testing led to the funneling of students into certain courses. So people that scored well might be allowed or be encouraged to go into maybe higher level or more difficult classes, whereas people who scored lower might be maybe mandated, probably definitely not encouraged, but maybe mandated to remedial courses, special education courses, or the like. And intelligence tests were also used to screen U.S. soldiers, both positively and negatively, right? For both for scores that indicate what they determined to be a good soldier, and then also scores that showed, maybe not so good of a soldier. And finally, and I think one that really is most pervasive today, it was used to write immigration law. Intelligence tests were given to many immigrants, both from Mexico, South America, Europe, through Ellis Island, and so on, which also were culturally specific, a lot of times not even measuring what it claims to measure. And so the results from these tests then were used to categorize people and to further differentiate and subjugate people. So now that we have a little bit of an understanding of how groups have kind of been classified and described historically on the basis of race, how has it added to or changed your understanding of racism and how it manifests today, both, I guess, globally and in America? So the question is essentially, given everything we've talked about, how has your perception changed, if any? I understand some of these things might take a little while to think about, but if there are any comments that anybody had, you can share them. Okay, thank you. I appreciate everybody's long-winded comment on that.
Someone else was gonna say something.
Did you want to say something, Sandy?
Yeah, but can you repeat like the exact question one more time?
Yeah, so the question that I had was just kind of, given the things we talked about, some of the information that I gave, has it changed or maybe added to your already existing ideas about race before we had this conversation? Like I said, it might be kind of tough. It's a really reflective question, but
I can say something if Sandy's not ready.
Sure. Yep.
My idea, racism or anything hasn't really changed, but it's nice to hear everybody's different perspectives because I've learned a lot of different thought processes from other people, so that was nice.
Absolutely, I agree. That's a big reason why I chose the four of you, especially personally knowing you guys. I know that each of you have interesting and insightful personal experiences, but then also in terms of communicating your thought process or your idea on things, I think I knew would be beneficial. And yeah, that was the idea of kind of the podcast in general, is just kind of be a learning environment, but also to explore different things or maybe think about things in ways that we hadn't previously. So I think we kind of hit on it. I don't really have any more questions or any more prompts. So for this last little bit, I'll just kind of open it up to the panel. If anybody has any last remarks, any questions, we could also bring up current events of both recently and historically, if we want to talk about that, if anything's pressing for anybody. But other than that, that kind of concludes all the points that I wanted to make in this podcast. So I really appreciate everybody's attention and everybody's openness in sharing and listening to others. So,
well, thanks for having me, man. Definitely appreciate it. Before we got on here, I was kind of reflecting personally on, kind of gathering my thoughts for the conversation. And I guess sitting here listening, I was just thinking a couple of weeks ago, I was sitting down with my grandpa who's about to turn 93 in February. So he's born in 1930. And I was like, wow, what a time to live through. Like, you lived through the end of World War II in high school. And I was talking to him about how he lived on the Air Force Base in Mobile, Alabama from 1950 to 1953, right before the end of segregation in schools. So he lived down in the South, and then obviously he went to Panama and then ended up moving to Pittsburgh. But I mean, he lived in Mobile, Alabama during, kind of the heart of it. And I was kind of asking him about his experiences there. And a lot of stories were kind of horrific, honestly. But I don't know. It gives me hope knowing that wasn't that long ago. That the civil rights happened in '64, and the segregation in school, Brown versus Board of Education, 1955. Only 60 years, but I feel like now is the best it's ever been. Even though America's had just a horrific historical past when it comes to race and racial relations and slavery, and it's just been horrible. But if you consider any rate of improvement, I think that the future is going to look pretty good, because I think that we're in the best spot that we have been, and forever, at least since the founding of this country. So, if anything, I have hope.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate your optimism.
Something that I was thinking about, like with the questions that we like had to think about before we came, I got a like flashback to high school when I first started filling out my FAFSA. Um, you you check your identity, and I was able to check Latin/Hispanic. I identify as Latina. I don't identify as Hispanic, and I can go into that. But as a 14-year-old, like, or sophomore, I was with my brother. He was filling out his FAFSA, and he was like, for race, it says white, Black, American Indian, Alaska, Asian, Native Hawaiian, or other. And he was like, where's like Hispanic? And he put other because he didn't know what to put. And I was like, that's so interesting. And like we were just so confused. Um, and then like when I participated in research, like I put other a lot of times, and I had to learn about it myself. I never had like a Latino professor. I've never had a teacher, or I've never even talked about this in class. But through my own like looking into everything, I learned that like people of Latino or Hispanic origins can be any race. It really depends on their ancestry, like where their like ancestors or where they originated from, like was it Central, South America, the Caribbean. So like I just didn't know any of this, but then like my experiences of discrimination were um there was a lot of internal self-conflict with when I learned this information, like my physical characteristics, like I learned what race is. I have been told that I am white passing, but my experiences of discrimination, both from white peers and I lived in the East Coast in an area where there was discrimination amongst Latinos and communities. Uh, more specifically for those who were Mexican, I was passing as other Latin ethnicities, and I was also white passing. But the second somebody found out that I was Mexican, I received a lot of different treatment. And when I share my experiences today, a lot of people are surprised that it was like discrimination from other Latinos. Um, and what I've gathered from my research with adolescents is that there's a lot of internal self-conflict, um, perhaps due to like being in school and feeling the pressure to assimilate in order to be seen as a good student, in order to be seen as, oh, you're Latino, but you're well behaved. You're not like the like other students. And something that I have been told by like what some white people is that I've heard them saying like stereotypical things about Mexican people. I've heard them say like I worked in IHOP and the chefs were like talking in Spanish and like a white woman said something really racist and I was looking at her and it's almost like she forgets that I am Mexican and she said, "Don't worry, honey, not you." And I'm like, that does not make it better. You are insulting like my culture and it hurt my feelings to hear that about somebody in my culture. So that's something that I have experienced. So through my understanding of like race and like my like physical characteristics, I have an internal self-conflict to still want to put other because I have pride in my culture. I really identify as like Latina and I took a Chicano Latino studies course that talked a lot about the difference of like Hispanic and Latin. And I'm really prideful about like my culture. So I don't know. I'd have to go into depth about that difference, but I've always I like for example, I had a best friend and her parents are Mexican. And she always would say, I'm Hispanic. And I'd be like, your parents are Mexican, like you're Latina. She's like, no, I'm Hispanic. So it's just like,
Would you mind, if you're comfortable, would you mind explaining differences between Latin and Hispanic? Because I wasn't aware that there were differences.
Hispanic is like you see yourself more as a descendant of Spain, whereas like Latin, like for example, like it can include Mexico, like other like South America, Central America, and so um yeah, for my experiences, I know that I have some descendants from Spain, but my culture is all Mexican. The food, the celebrations, the the clothing that I wear, and the times that I've seen something on TV where it's like Spanish language, sometimes I don't know what the words are. So like I identify more as Latina and not Hispanic. And with my friends who I know for a fact are very Mexican, I wonder if there's some internal conflict and some fear of rejection or like them wanting to be seen as like the good Latinos, where they prefer to assimilate and kind of reject that like Latino pride.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing both the difference between Latin and Hispanic and your personal experiences. I just a quick note. I like I said, I wasn't aware. I understand that they're two different words, so they probably do have some intellectual differences. So, but from what I gather, just so I'm clear from what you're saying, it has to do more so with geographic or national origin and versus necessarily racial identity. Okay. Okay. Interesting. Thank you. Anybody else wanted to chime in? Just free thoughts, things that you thought were interesting. No comment is also okay too. I'm seeing a question that I actually had for you, as Sandy was talking about, and I'll preface this by saying I'm asking Hasina specifically because I know that she is an alumnus of and attends an HBCU, historically Black college and university. And so, and a thought that I had when Sandy was mentioning that she had never had any Latin professors or teachers or anything like that, the first thought that I had was, what experiences did you have going from Oregon, predominantly white state with white instructors, white teachers, for the most part? And I just was wondering what experiences you had with going from presumably, and so excuse me for assuming, but assume very small to no interactions with Black faculty or instructors or teachers. So I just was interested to know what that was like for you, if you might.
Yeah. Um, in Portland, I think has everyone been to Oregon here?
Yep, everyone here, I think, both has been to Oregon and Portland.
Most of my teachers from elementary, actually all of my teachers from elementary up to high school were all white. Um, I didn't have a Black teacher until I came down here to Tuskegee, or a Hispanic teacher. My first Hispanic teacher, my first Indian teacher. I've also had Asian teachers. Didn't come until I was down here. So, um, it's a really good experience to see people that look like you reflected in education, in higher education especially. It's very empowering. It's because it's hard to see yourself as something when you're not represented. Um, yeah. But as far as just like the whole experience and everything, it's empowering. It's a it's like a good foundation, a really good support system. Yeah, it's been very encouraging. It's been a really good experience, very empowering. If I had to put it in one word, it would be empowering for sure. So, yeah,
Thank you for
it's
sharing that.
actually inspired me to go or seek higher education. Like I've been thinking about like going into education. I'm not really sure, but
Oh,
it's like I feel like, where else to start than with yourself, be the change you want to see. So, yeah.
absolutely. I think Dr. Polk would make a great instructor.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. That's something I've always wanted to ask you, in terms of those differences. Very cool. And just to kind of echo what you guys were saying, I know it doesn't apply to me in terms of representation because I guess it depends how you look at it. Fortunately and unfortunately, I'm pretty represented everywhere, right? White heterosexual men are seen as the dominant class. Um, but I also never had any Black teachers, any Hispanic teachers. I'm trying to think. I don't think I had any Asian teachers either, elementary, middle, or high school, all white. And it wasn't until college, even though I went to a predominantly white university as well, I had no Black professors and one Hispanic and one or Hispanic Latin and one Asian. So I just wanted to echo how important and because I learned so much from their different teaching styles, their experiences, and who they are as people, different from what I have learned from other white professors. So I just want to echo the importance of representation and yeah, I think you hit it right on the head, Hasina. It's hard to see yourself being something if you haven't seen anybody who you could identify with also be in those similar spaces. So I appreciate that. Okay, Nick, is there anything you wanted to add? Eric? I don't want to leave anybody out. But if no one has anything else to say, I think we can wrap it up.
Now for me again, I'm just happy to hear from everybody. It's nice to hear everybody's thought processes and perspectives. And if we do it again, I would love to. That'd be fun. So just let me know everybody's schedules. That's
Yeah.
something we can happen.
Would that be something that y'all would be interested in doing? I don't know, once a month, something like that. Maybe we pick a topic, or maybe something has happened and we jump on. We don't even necessarily need to post it if we don't want to, but just as a way for us to talk about things. That could be cool.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah, appreciate the conversation.
Thank you. Appreciate your perspective, and of course, both you and Hasina being flexible with time. I know for y'all it's almost 10:30 now. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Y'all have a good night. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care,
Bye.
brother.
Bye-bye.
Yep. Everybody have a good night.
Take care, y'all.
It's nice to meet you.
Good night.
Good night.